keep an eye on the chat over here. I'm going to mute myself.
And I'm going to mute Julie on Google Meet. Julie, can you still hear us on Google Meet? Great. So do you see, let's see, if you scroll down, settings. So do you see, let's see, if you scroll down, sorry, there we go. Julie, can you give people a hello, we're problem solving, because I think we got a few people who've joined us.
Hi all, thanks so much for joining. We are learning new things in vivo right now, so just give us a couple of moments and we will kick this off in just a few moments. I have some slides I wanted to share and we're trying to figure out how to do that. And if not, then we'll figure out how to share them another way.
Julie, I hate to say it, but I think if you're comfortable proceeding without your slides, that might be our best bet for today.
Just go, not a problem. All right, so I have these lovely slides presented or that I've created, and I'm happy to share them out in other kinds of ways. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what does Dobbs mean for us as mental health professionals, licensed mental health professionals. And I think a lot of times it seems like this might be something that might impact our clients more so than us. And I wish that was, well, no, I don't wish it only impacted them either, but I think that's an easier way of sitting on a place of privilege to be able to think about it. But we are medical professionals, and some of the laws that are coming out are not clear in terms of their implications. So we'll talk more about it, and it's not all doom and gloom, I promise. So one of the things that's really challenging is that we are on a slippery and very changing slope. And it seems like day by day, that slope keeps on, the map keeps on changing. So there's a great map that you can find at guttmacher.org, guttmacher.org. They have pretty up-to-date maps in terms of what does the landscape around abortion look like, which states are most restrictive to which states are most protective. And you know, even thinking about what's coming out in the news this week in terms of North Carolina potentially enacting a 12-week ban, and South Carolina trying to enact a total ban, and having enough of the legislature being okay to enact a 6-week ban. Currently, it's 22 weeks. So, as I said, these things continue to shift, and it can feel really dizzying trying to keep abreast of what are the laws that are passing, and then what are the courts doing about them? Because just because states have laws doesn't mean that the courts are necessarily upholding the laws within that state. So what happened last June is the Supreme Court said, hey, the feds have to get out of the abortion business until there is a federal law that Congress passes, and until that time, really this needs to be regulated on a state-by-state basis. And of course, that is super challenging given what our our landscape looks like, what it means in terms of how do we travel and how do we get information. And as mental health professionals, how we are even doing our work. With the passage of PsyPAC over the last several years, it has enabled psychologists to practice over state lines. And I know the Counseling Compact is getting into gear. So these are other issues too that can complicate. And as I said, we'll make sure that we talk more about it in a little bit. So why should we care? Part of the reason why it's important for us to care is that I want to acknowledge a lot of people watching this might not work with people that are struggling with unplanned pregnancies, or might even have to encounter abortion care. So it might seem like, but you know what, I just work with postpartum people. Why do we need to care about this? So we really need to think about maternal health and wellness on a spectrum, that it's not only about what's happening in pregnancy and postpartum, but also prior to achieving pregnancy. And so why do we need to care? Well, if I'm in Louisiana, they have a law that says you can't even store embryos there. So if I'm trying to build my family and I'm doing IVF, I have to do fresh transfers. And that impacts what kind of treatment I choose, where I go. A lot of times people in Louisiana will go to other states in order to be able to cryopreserve extra embryos. So that's on the one end of how we think about it. We also know that just because someone attains pregnancy, we can't guarantee that pregnancy is a risk-free state. So there's a lot of pregnancy complications that can arise, and some can arise really suddenly. So being able to know what those complications are and how to best support our clients who might have experienced them in the past and are worried about subsequent pregnancies and experiencing them again, are currently experiencing them, or have previously experienced them and now are trying to process through that trauma that they've just endured. So we have to think about that as well. And we have to think about too, like, we know that maternal mental health is the greatest complication postpartum. And so what happens when that mental health is combined with a potential perinatal loss or a traumatic event? And that traumatic event might have been that, the baby was able to be born and go into the NICU, but trying to access care or waiting to access care was where the trauma was imparted. It might have been for a person to have to be so close to death that any doctor could reasonably say, we need to do what we can to save her. And that might mean deliver. And so are we looking at extremely micro preemies? What is going on in terms of what's happening within the whole family? And so all of these pieces impact us when we work with people who are pregnant or people that are postpartum. It's also important for us is, what is our client's previous history? So I know a lot of people, and they come in to me, they're struggling with infertility, and they say, well, it must be because of that abortion that I had when I was 19 years old. Even though there is no medical link between previous abortion and infertility, that is a myth that has been promulgated and propagated, and it's incorrect. And so being able to work with people around that. I've had people come in, particularly right after the Dobbs decision, telling me about abortions that they had never shared before because it had been so stigmatized, and the fear that comes out that now this might not be an option for people. So there's so many different ways in which we can hear and be a part of this for people. And we have to think too that the laws that are being promulgated are more than medical. So it's not only about what's happening medically, but if we think about the state of Texas, which seems to be an incubator of a lot of these laws, we think about the Senate bill from last year, SB 8, and that went to the Supreme Court, who just kind of sat on it. But what that said was there could be penalties for anyone that is aiding and abetting an abortion. So what does that mean? What does it mean to aid and abet? Most simplistically, it means somebody who's helping out someone else seeking out abortion access or care. So that law impacts taxi drivers, Lyft drivers, Uber drivers, because if they're driving someone from their home to a clinic, technically they're aiding and abetting. That law potentially impacts therapists if we are to share information so that people can make healthcare choices for themselves. Then we are aiding and abetting. There's a case that's happening now in Texas where a woman claimed that her husband was abusing her emotionally, and she became pregnant, and she told 3 of her friends and said, I need your help accessing medication for a medication abortion because I can't raise a child with this man. I'll never be able to get out. He found those text messages, and so he is now suing and claiming that the friends aided and abetted his wife in obtaining an abortion. So we're watching as that one goes back or goes through the court system. We'll see what happens there. What this does is it tends to have a chilling effect, and that's something that certainly we have seen on a more macro level in terms of OBGYNs. And when I say a chilling effect, it means that people are stopping practicing. So whether that means they're not practicing abortion care, or maybe they're giving up OBGYN altogether, or maybe they're even leaving the states. So we are seeing in Ohio that at least 2 hospitals have closed their maternity wings because there are no physicians that are willing to risk their licenses to try to provide care. We think about all of these emergent situations that can occur within a hospital setting. These doctors feel really handcuffed, and they don't feel like they can provide care to patients without risking losing their license or getting sued. And so rather than try to figure out things with these laws in place, they've just said, I'm going to practice somewhere where I don't have to worry about this, where I can practice medicine in the way that I was taught. I can also know that there's a chilling effect in terms of mental health clinicians, particularly those in states that have these more stringent and extreme kinds of laws. So I know that people are concerned about what do they say on their website around counseling and around even abortion as a word on their website. People are concerned about what do we talk about in our offices. These are all really understandable concerns. And what do we do then in terms of our documentation? How do we document if someone's coming in and they're contemplating abortion? How do we say that? Do we use the word abortion in our notes? Do we say, thinking about pregnancy decision making? Or do we say something even more general, which is like, spoke about decision making and assisted client in figuring out ways to come to a conclusion for herself? It could be really vague like that, but it's changing too how we might document, because certainly anyone and anything can be subpoenaed. So all, again, different considerations to make. When we're thinking, just to sort of go into more depth, when we're looking at maternal health complications, and I mentioned about infertility, but also thinking about our clients that might miscarry. And again, in many states, doctors don't even feel like they can perform a D&C for a miscarriage or give medication for a miscarriage, lest they be called out by someone accusing them of providing abortion care. And medically, a D&C and medication like mifepristone are both used not only for abortions, but also for miscarriage management. We think about ectopic pregnancies, where there is absolutely no ability for the pregnancy to come to any kind of fruition or viability, because a pregnancy cannot grow in a fallopian tube, it cannot grow on a cervix, it cannot grow on the endometrium, and it cannot grow outside the uterus. And just to clarify, no, we are not at a place of science fact where we can bring that developing embryo and implant it into the uterus. I think a lot of people are like, why? We can implant lots of things. Why not do that? So, unfortunately, that's not something that is possible. So, the only remedy for an ectopic pregnancy is to have an abortion, is to end that pregnancy. Sometimes it also means in losing a tube or losing part of the cervix in order to be able to remove that pregnancy. We think about things like HELP and mirror syndromes. These are syndromes that, if if a person who's pregnant finds themselves in this situation, these are syndromes that can cause death. So, not treating them, waiting to gestate longer, waiting closer to viability, means that the more time we wait, the closer the pregnant person is to death. And, I know of cases where people didn't get HELP syndrome until 32, 33 weeks. And even though the baby was able to be delivered, unfortunately, the baby didn't survive. So these are catastrophic, worst case scenario kinds of instances that we hope don't happen, that we have to act really decisively when they do. And when we act decisively, it does not mean that we stop and we check with the lawyers to see, hey, are we able to do this or not? We also have to think about, what about people who are on medication prior to attaining pregnancy? Perhaps they weren't trying to get pregnant, their birth control failed, and they're on like phenobarbital, or they're on really strong kinds of medication that say on the packaging that this is not, this is counterindicated to use in pregnancy. And in those circumstances, it makes sense again to be able to access abortion care should birth control fail. So thinking about that, or someone who didn't realize they were pregnant and then had to go under anesthesia. And so even though they do pregnancy tests before someone goes under anesthesia, there is still the risk that the pregnancy test comes back negative because HCG levels, it's a barely new pregnancy and HCG levels aren't detectable yet. And that person can be pregnant under anesthesia. So those might be other circumstances where someone who's pregnant might choose to have abortion care. So just trying to broaden into this thinking that we might not realize that abortion is something that we need to learn to work with, and that it does impact us. And finally, just thinking too about the condition of hyperemesis gravidum, that can be such an intense symptomatology that occurs with pregnancy, and the only cure for it is to not be pregnant. And so I have worked with people and they've chosen to terminate wanted pregnancies because the hyperemesis was too much to bear. So all of these are reasons in which we might work with people that then choose to need abortion care. I mentioned before too, in terms of what our clients' previous history might be. So in addition to them having their own abortion experience, I have seen clients come in where these laws are just triggering for them. And it might not just be because of abortion, but it might be because of any kind of governmental restriction. So if we think about people who have come to the United States as refugees, any kind of infringement on freedom can be a trigger to those past experiences. So again, it's really important to know this, to see what people are reading, to understand it, what's happening in the news, that in and of itself, even if abortion is not something touching them, there are ways that this can trigger other kinds of trauma responses. And then another group of people we don't tend to think a whole lot about are people that might be grandparent age, and thinking about their children that are of reproductive age and what kind of potential choices they have. So I saw this a lot too post Dobbs. people that had adult children that were of reproductive age and thinking about family building and really having fear around what does this look like and what happens if there is a problem in the pregnancy, and will they be okay? Will they be able to access care? So all of these are concerns that we might see that we don't expect necessarily to come into our offices. So I talked about the more than medical part of the laws, these bounty laws, where, and I guess I didn't describe that a whole lot. Bounty laws are basically the idea that I can accuse anyone of having an abortion or assisting in an abortion. And because they're civil and not criminal, I can earn $10,000. I'm not sure how much burden of proof, this is a law SB 8 in Texas, how much burden of proof it puts on it. So that becomes a concern. When are people turning one another in? Because $10,000 can be a lot of money. That I think is another place where as clinicians, we want to be really aware. And as I mentioned, that example of the husband who used the bounty law so that he could accuse his wife's friends of aiding and abetting. So all of these things make it a really scary climate, not only just for people, but also for us as clinicians. So I think when I mentioned too the chilling effect, and I talked about its impact on hospitals and individual physicians, as well as some of the impact on mental health professionals. I know of other colleagues who they have switched populations because this seems so risky to work with anymore. And they have families to consider and wanting to make sure that no one can accuse them. I have other colleagues and friends that are clinicians, and they look at it as, okay, I'm going to do my part because I don't believe in what these laws are, and so this is going to be how I resist, is I'm going to continue on and adhere to my standards of care. So again, there's lots of different responses in terms of how clinicians feel about this. Where I become really scared is if I think about some of the potential logical conclusions of these laws and where they're going. And the first logical conclusion that I come up with is that they start enacting personhood laws. And groups like Susan B. Anthony, which is an extremely pro-life think tank, that's their goal. That's what they're hoping for. So personhood would confer a person status to an embryo. So an embryo is just a sperm and an egg put together, maybe just a couple of days past the initial cellular divisions, but that's what we're talking about here, that they have the full rights and privileges that any of us do that are on this Facebook Live right now. That's a really kind of scary thought. And so where I think about it is, okay, if states are looking at abortion as murder and killing embryos constitutes to murder because that's killing people, first it makes me wonder, what is the future of IVF? Are you able to freeze people, and can you do that without their consent? Does it mean that we have to go back to just doing fresh cycles and transferring more embryos than might be safe for people because we can't cryopreserve them anymore? Does it mean that if someone who is newly pregnant and is talking to me about it and says that she doesn't want to be pregnant and she wants to have an abortion, does it mean now that I am state obligated to call CPS? Because is this a duty to harm? Is this a duty to warn, or is this a duty to report? So I have to think about, again, there's where my fear is. By the way, none of this is real right now. So I'm just talking about like potential logical conclusions that could come up. And so that's really where I become worried about is, do we go to this really bizarro world kind of case where we are now equating abortion with child abuse, child neglect, child endangerment, murder, all of these things where, okay, as clinicians, we do have ethical and legal obligations. So in most states, if you know of a child who is being harmed, we have a time frame in which we need to report it. And so that's another concern. Of course, it means that systems like child and family welfare systems, which are already overburdened, are going to be even more so. And then I guess the question too is, do attorney generals even press these charges, or do local prosecutors even press charges for things like this? Is this so low on the totem pole that maybe they just don't? And then going back to that aiding and abetting. So if I'm putting something on my website, does that constitute aiding and abetting? If I share website links, or I at least give the names of different organizations in which people could obtain their own information, am I aiding and abetting there? If I share things like incognito mode on a browser in which my clients might be able to look at different organizations or access to care kinds of places, am I aiding and abetting there? So wondering too, is there going to be more of these laws that spread across the country, or are we going to find that we just kind of peter out, that these aren't enforceable, that they're just kind of, they're just too much? I hope it's the latter. So I don't want to end on a low note like that. What can we say? What can we do? So some of the work that I do is I work with people prior to pregnancy. And we talk about, in terms of pre-pregnancy planning, if for whatever reason you needed to access abortion care, what would that look like? And again, depending upon what state they're living in, even if these are wanted pregnancies, we know things can go terribly wrong. So, talking about what's the closest state and what are their cutoffs. I think things start getting really challenging when we talk about fetal anomalies that aren't discovered until the 20th week. So I might say to people, it might make sense to have that anatomy scan done at week 18 or 19 so that you could get a second opinion in state versus having to go elsewhere for a second opinion or potentially a procedure. Again, depending upon where these boundaries are within a particular state, that can be based upon what recommendations. And because no one's pregnant yet, this is a safe place legally in which we can have free reign over anything that we might talk about, because we're talking about a potential pregnancy. We're not talking about an actual pregnancy. So I think it's really important too that these conversations start to come up. Even though they might not be solicited by our clients, I think it's really important to be able to say even things like, have you thought about what it might look like if you're in that rare circumstance where things go wrong in the pregnancy? And what would your needs be? And how would we make sure that those needs get met? So being able to ask that kind of question. I mentioned a little earlier, what potential impact on reproductive choices, like creating embryos. So if we have clients in Louisiana, or we have clients maybe in Oklahoma, and they want to create embryos, we might suggest, hey, if you are able to send those embryos to a sister clinic in another state, you might want to do that for safekeeping. Or if you're in a state where, like South Carolina, where things are kind of touch and go, maybe it makes sense to send any cryopreserved embryos elsewhere. My clients in Virginia are wondering, what do we do with it? It doesn't look like the state legislature really has the appetite to look at this, even though the governor is making a lot of noise about it. So for that reason, okay, you can keep things in place, but if it would make you feel better to transfer your embryos elsewhere to Maryland or DC, then okay, consider that. When we are talking to people about what they're doing, and we're talking about discernment, like I am pregnant and I don't know what I should do about that. These happen to be some of my favorite work that I do is not because I'm invested in whatever decision people make, but I appreciate being part of the process in which I can help a person make their own decision. And so I have no opinion, and I say that at the onset, I have no opinion upon what the end result is, but talking about how do we make that pro con list about staying pregnant versus terminating a pregnancy, and that staying pregnant has pros and it has cons, and terminating the pregnancy has pros and it has cons. Being able to talk to people about what do you imagine life might look like 6 months from now, 2 years from now. So I'm not offering any opinions, I'm not offering any judgments, I'm not offering any advice, but what I am offering is a framework in which people can learn to make their own decisions. So being able to do that without necessarily the details of, okay, there's a clinic on this street and you should go there and here's the phone number. So even being more oblique in terms of, you know, if you have a mode on your laptop in which you can have more privacy, you might want to consider that as you start looking for different websites or different places where you can access care. You know, finding different clinics, things like that. Aid Access is a great website. Certainly Planned Parenthood is a great website. There's so many wonderful groups doing incredible work too. Even being able to connect people to abortion funds, because if you have to travel out of state, it's now not just the cost of the abortion, but it's getting there too. So when, in terms of what can we say, it's really, really, really important to know your state's ever-changing laws. And as I mentioned, Guttmacher is a great source for looking at it, and they break it down as well. I think it's really useful too to figure out who your local state delegate is and get on their newsletter, because at the end of session they'll send all of their constituents who have subscribed a newsletter around their accomplishments and what they've done. And if they are someone who is anti-choice, they will talk about the anti-choice legislation they helped. If there's someone that is working to expand abortion access and your state was able to do that, they are very happy to talk about those kinds of state accomplishments. So that's another way to really stay up to date and clear about what is happening in your state. And as I said, that's really important because these things keep on changing. So overall, is there hope? I have to say yes, I think there is hope. I think nobody thought that we would be in the situation that we are now. Well, I should say that the majority of people didn't think it. All of us activists totally knew that this was a thing. And what we know is that the majority of Americans, time and time and time again, show that they don't support total restrictions on abortion. That over 60% of Americans agree that some kind of abortion access is important and should be available. So that's important. And we know this, that even in states where we wouldn't think that these would be the numbers, we had 70% of people in Kansas come out and support, or actually not support, a bill that would allow the legislature to make laws around abortion. They firmly said, nope, we are not okay with this. And nobody expected in an off-year election that it was going to have as much popularity, that people would come out and really make this known. We're seeing on other states, abortion referendums are coming on the ballot. So in my state, what my state wants to do is to codify abortion as part of the state constitution, which means that the state constitution protects it as much as the state can. And so it passed. It will be a ballot measure come 2024. And so that also is a really big deal, being able to go out and vote for it. We saw in Wisconsin, and I'm getting really granular here, but I pay attention. So we saw in Wisconsin there was a Supreme Court seat in their state Supreme Court that was vacant. And there was someone who would be very kind to abortion legislation, and there was someone else who has been very outspoken that he was very against any kind of abortion legislation. And there is a case that's coming up in that state's Supreme Court. And because the state knew this, they elected the justice who was supportive of abortion rights. She won in Wisconsin in a landslide in an off-year election. Their election was in like March. Who comes out in March for an election, or April? So that's really important to see what some of these states are saying to us, that again, time and time and time again, more people supported this justice being appointed to the court than determined any other election in the state of Wisconsin the last several years. So that really speaks volumes. I think it's really important for us as mental health professionals to get involved. And we can do so in one of many ways. And this is another reason why I think there's a lot of hope, is there are a lot of stories out there. So maybe it is us helping a client decide that yes, they want to share their story about abortion. Or maybe it's us sharing it, with all the appropriate identifying information taken out, but sharing different things that we see in terms of abortion access and abortion care. Or if you have your own story around abortion access and abortion care, being able to share that. So all of these ways, because what we know is that people tend to be pretty hard-lined in what their thoughts and their beliefs are until they meet someone that can change it because of a personal experience that they had. That really doing that personal work and that storytelling and that story sharing work is impactful and important. I think other things that, we're thinking about too is if you live in a state where things are really restrictive, you can use conscientious objector status. That was something that mental health professionals used in Vietnam. That was something that a lot of people used in terms of Vietnam, where, we have a conscientious objection to what is being put on me. So the positive to that is, as mental health clinicians, we're pretty unlikely to be gone after in terms of any kind of legal issue. It's not that it's impossible, it's just that we're pretty small fish there. And so that can also be helpful too. Of course, I say these things, and I'm not saying that there's no risk that could be incurred with it. So it would be something to really consider. Talk to family and friends about that as well. But it's okay for us to have strong beliefs and to be able to live by those beliefs. So again, we're not likely to be these legal test cases. And that too is another place where it brings me some hope. So on that, because I know we all have busy days and I want to give people a little chance to ask some questions, make comments, anything that you can think about. And happy to hear from you all, but thank you so much for coming. And you can see that in the chat, there have been a lot of comments in terms of aid access and Guttmacher. Thank you so much, Chuck, for putting those things in the chat. So if anyone has any comments, has any questions, I really welcome it. Otherwise, thanks so much for having me as the first Tuesday tea. Where would I recommend people look for further training? That is a great question, Chuck. So as I mentioned, I look at reproductive health as a continuum. I think it's really important that we have more than just pregnancy kinds of training. There's not really abortion-focused training right now. I am working on a book right now for mental health professionals, so that should come out in 2024. So I'm excited for that. But I also offer a year-long class on reproductive psychology. And of course, we talk about all of the nuances that can come up within this really broad spectrum of the reproductive time period for people. So I am certainly happy to have people reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Thanks again for putting that in the chat. Thank you, Mara. I hope the book will be really good. I think so too. So another question was, I know clinicians are scared right now. Do any guidance for how clinicians can be supportive to clients needing abortion access in states where it's risky? I think we do the things that we're really good at, right? So how do we regulate ourselves so that our clients aren't feeling our emotions around it? And it's really having a strong sense of, what do I feel like I can say as a therapist, and what do I feel like how much risk do I want to incur? And as I said, I don't think there's as much risk to incur as this chilling effect is making us feel, but I'm not a lawyer. And so I think it's really useful to have a group of colleagues and friends that you can talk to. I have a text chain that is like, actually a couple of text threads that are just really like my lifeline when it comes to stuff like this. And when things are hard, I can reach out to them and I can get guidance from them. And that's really, really useful. So being able to be in spaces like Touchstone and other spaces where there are clinicians that are doing similar work like this, all of that is so super helpful and useful. Finding other people that can be supportive, that are thinking along the same kind of lines as you, all of that is really, really useful. So on that, if there's no other questions, you all are free to reach out to me by email. My email is drbindeman@gmail.com. So D-R-B like boy, I-N like Nancy, D like dog, E-M like Mary, A-N like Nancy @gmail. Feel free to reach out, drop me a line, ask me questions. I really welcome it. So those that were able to view live, thank you so much. Those that are watching this, the recorded version, I hope you enjoyed. Have a wonderful rest of your day.